This lecture is about UCC section 2-202, which is about the statute of frauds, but it is this section dealing with the statute of frauds between merchants. Now, 2-201 subsection 1 says that you need a writing signed by the party who denies the contract or who denies the modification. And 2-201 says, with the exceptions as stated in this section. Well, 2-201, there are two exceptions to needing that signature of the person who denies the contract. One is if it's between merchants and one merchant sent the confirmation to the other merchant, the other merchant received it and didn't sign it, and we're going to go through the details of that one in just a moment. And the other exception is in subsection 3, where you have a contract that has been fully performed on one side and accepted by the other, or where you have a contract for the sale of goods which are especially manufactured goods, and one other exception there. So the point here is that in 2-202, this is one of the exceptions to the requirement, to the case where you require the signature of the person who is denying the contract. In 2-201 subsection 2, here are the parts you need to keep in mind. Number one, first let me read you the code section, then we'll go through it in detail. It reads as follows. It says, and you should have a copy of the code in front of you, it says, between merchants, if within a reasonable time a writing in confirmation of the contract and sufficient against the sender is received, and the party receiving it has reason to know of its contents, it satisfies the requirements of subsection 1, the $500 rule that says you need a writing, against such party unless written notice of the objection is given within 10 days after it is received. Now, with that in mind, let's look at what the requirements are. It first says that this only works between merchants. So this means both parties have to be merchants. If one party is a non-merchant, this whole section simply does not apply. How do you decide if someone is a merchant? And the answer is that at 2-105 is a definition of merchants, and there's a lecture on that. But a quick summary is that you can be a merchant, a person can be a merchant in 3 ways. One is to be one who deals in goods of the kind. Now you want to be careful there, because if I'm General Motors and you are a paint manufacturer, and let's say I buy paint from you for my cars, I buy a lot of paint from you. But in buying a lot of paint from you, I am not a dealer in paint. Okay? The person selling me the paint may be a dealer in paint, but I'm not a dealer in paint just because I buy a lot of paint from you. If I bought it and sold it to somebody else, or if I manufactured it and sold it to somebody, I would be a dealer in paint. But I'm not a dealer in paint just because I buy a lot. So one way to be a dealer is one who deals, is to be a merchant. Is to be one who deals in goods of the kind. The second way to be a merchant is to be one who, by his occupation, his or her obviously, but the code says by the person's occupation, the person claims specialized knowledge about the goods or the type of transaction. Now it's got to be by occupation. For example, if we're buying and selling a car, and if I race cars on the weekends, I build them and I race them on weekends for fun, it's a hobby, it's not my occupation, even though I know a lot about it. The code says if I'm a mechanic by occupation, and now you want to buy my car, I will be treated as a merchant. If I want to sell you my car, I will be treated as a merchant. But it's by occupation, not hobby or anything else. So 2 ways to be a merchant so far. One who deals in goods of the kind, one who by his or her occupation claims specialized knowledge, and the third way to be a merchant is to be one who has hired an intermediary to act on your behalf, and the intermediary, by that person's occupation, claims specialized knowledge about the goods. For if I want to sell you my car, and I've got a Rolls Royce, and I want to sell it to you for $100,000, and I hire a mechanic to as my intermediary to represent my interest in dealing with you. If I hire an intermediary and that person helps me in the transaction with you, and the intermediary by the intermediary's occupation claims specialized knowledge, then I will be treated as a merchant. You see this in a number of cases. One case where a person was buying 10,000 pounds of bolts per month because they were manufacturing some motors or something and they needed bolts. They were buying 10,000 pounds of bolts per month. Well, the seller of those bolts was obviously a merchant. But the buyer is not a merchant just because they buy a lot of bolts. But what you do on the bar exam is you say, this person who's buying that many bolts probably has an employee, that's their intermediary, who by his or her occupation claims to know a lot about bolts. And the same thing with General Motors. If I am buying millions of gallons of paint per year, and I've got somebody on my General Motors staff who's my paint expert. So I have hired an intermediary and I will be treated as a merchant. So those are the three ways to be a merchant. You find those at 2-105. So this section says it only applies if it's between merchants. If between merchants, a written confirmation is received. Notice all three of these now. We're going to go through them one at a time. Written confirmation that is sufficient against the sender. This means if the sender sent a note that just says, how you doing, Merry Christmas, that's not sufficient against the sender. The sender sends a note that's not signed or something that will do as a signature. So it's got to, what is sent has got to be sufficient against the sender. We know what has to be sufficient for goods. You have to show intent to contract. You have to identify the goods and the quantity. That's all you have to have in the parties, of course. Sufficient against the sender and is received within a reasonable time. Not sent within a reasonable time, but received within a reasonable time. And finally, within a reasonable time, we have that here. In several of the problems that have been on the bar, they told you that a merchant sent the written confirmation to the other party, but they don't tell you when they got it. And you have sometimes some other facts in the problem, you can figure out they got it within a month or something, or within a reasonable time. But be sure to raise that issue that it isn't clear from the facts whether or not it was received within a reasonable time. Then this code section 2-201 subsection 2 goes on to say, first, between merchants. Secondly, the written confirmation that was sufficient against the sender received within a reasonable time. And finally, the next one is the receiver has to have reason to know of the contents. Now, the bar examiners often tell you, or sometimes have said, the person received it but did not read it. Well, then you've got to decide whether or not the person had reason to know of the contents. And it's often a debatable point. And it's not your conclusion that matters, it's that you saw the problem, you did the analysis. So, for example, if you and I form a contract today over the telephone, and we're both merchants, and you get a letter from me in 2 days, well, arguably, that's reason to know what's in there. Or if I told you, I'll send you a written confirmation, that's reason enough to know what's in there. So, make your argument. It doesn't matter whether it sticks or not. You saw the issue, you knew the rule at that level of detail. Besides reason to know of the contents, the final one is that if you have met all these requirements, it's between merchants. The written confirmation met its requirements. The receiver has reason to know of the contents. This satisfies the writing against the recipient unless the recipient sends a written, not by phone, a written objection, gives a written objection within 10 days. Now, you can give the written objection in writing by handing it to the person, by sending email, by mailing it to them. And so if you send them written, anyway, the code says you must give the written objection, give notice of the written objection within 10 days of the date that the person receives it. Not within 10 days of when the other person sent it to me, but within 10 days of when I got it, I gave written notice to the other side. Emails, handing it to them. U.S. mail, if you sent a U.S. mail, the code doesn't really specifically deal with this, but I think that it would count from the date when it was sent, because that's when most things count in contract. So this is what 2-201 subsection 2 is about. Let me give you some examples of where this has been tested. Here, one of the problems that the bar examiners had, which I call the tech data problem, this was a case where tech was a university and data is a person who sells monitoring equipment. And the university, the something tech university, MIT or something, wanted to buy some monitoring equipment, and turns out that tech sent data a written confirmation of their telephone transaction, or it was actually not on a phone, it was in person, but they didn't sign anything, and tech sent data, the written confirmation. You had to show that tech was a merchant and data was a merchant, so that this was between merchants, because data never signed what was sent to it. Is tech a university dealing in this kind of equipment? Are they a merchant? Well, your occupation is that your argument is that the university, tech, doesn't have an occupation, but the university probably, the people who are doing the research using the monitoring equipment, they probably know a lot about that equipment. The professor probably knows a lot about that equipment. So probably you can find that the tech was a merchant by the second method, that they've hired an intermediary. The third method, they've hired an intermediary. There's a turbine question that the bar examiners gave, where one company was buying a turbine from someone else, and after they negotiated the deal, the buyer sent a written confirmation. And, pardon me, the seller sent a written confirmation to the buyer, because the seller is obviously I've forgotten who sent it to whom, it doesn't matter. You had to show that both parties were merchants. And the person who's selling the turbine obviously is a merchant in turbines. But the person who is buying the turbine, you had to show that that person also was a merchant. And they told you that the buyer of the turbine was building an industrial plant using the turbine. Well, that person, by his or her occupation, knows a lot about turbines. And that's why they would be treated as a merchant. There's another problem where they were selling pins, large numbers of pins, and you had to show in that case that both parties were merchants. In that case, trying to recall, the person who was selling the pins was obviously a merchant, but the person who was buying the pins was not a merchant, and they didn't deal in pins. They didn't. Their occupation wasn't anything about pins, and they didn't hire an intermediary who knew a lot about pins. So you may not have, in this case, both parties may not be merchants. The Motors versus Jones problem is the problem where one person is buying 10,000 pounds of bolts per month from the other, and the buyer would be treated like the General Motors in the paint case, that they probably got an expert in bolts because they deal in such large quantities of bolts. So those are examples of where this code section was tested, 2-201 subsection 2. It's tested a lot. When you test it, when it comes up, a lot of times what people do is they give kind of a generalized thing. This is between merchants, and therefore the receiving merchant does not need to sign. Well, you see, they lost a lot of points. If you know this detail and you put it in there, you get a lot more points. And that's the end of the lecture on subsection 2-201, subsection 2.